And we're starting the second panel. And as you will see, I think that in today's discussion, and some topics are absolutely intertwining. Just 15 minutes ago, Professor Ronnie Stauber talked to and answering to the question about Adenauer's position. He said he quoted the fact that Adenauer took into account the general German mood at that time, and that's why he insisted on his certain statements at that time. The other statement saying that the German people was responsible came only 50 or 40 years after. So their statements or actions or leaders coming from leaders who come from above, and at the same time we have what we call, and Sabina talked about the enormous exchange, the active exchange program between France and Germany. So there's also a movement which prepares the ground for political statements. There's a movement, a grassroots movement. And so we will study in our second panel, we will try to see what goes first, if something should go first, because it's sometimes very hard to distinguish what should be first, the politicians or the movement from the ground. One of the, from our point of view, let's say it's a general knowledge, but one of the best cases in recent resolution of conflicts is the Northern Ireland situation. And luckily we have a very experienced speaker, Reverend Dr. Gary Mason, who is very well, and who is a promoter of a grassroots movement. And Gary Mason will join us just in a couple of seconds, and we will talk about how the reconciliation in Northern Ireland was became possible because there was a preparation in the minds of the people. Though today, if we follow the Northern Ireland situation, I think that Gary will probably elaborate on this. It doesn't mean that everything is settled. 25 years after the Good Friday Agreement, there are many anxieties among the people actually themselves on both sides, and worries. So it's not an easy process, even if a politician decided to put their signature in the document, right? Gary, please.
Okay, Dmitry, thank you. It's good morning from Belfast and good afternoon, I know, for a number of you. So I just want to take 15 minutes just to highlight some of the concepts and theories that Dmitry was alluding to. I'm just simply entitling this The Long War, which it was a long war of 30 years, and The Long Peace, because we're 26 years into a peace process. Not dissimilar to most conflicts, we had the normal three concepts of land, identity, and religion were part of our conflict. Northern Ireland, or the north of Ireland, or the 6 counties, we still don't agree today on what to call it. Not dissimilar to the Middle East. Was it the Nakba? Was it the War of Independence? So we're not even agreed on what we call the space in which we actually live at the moment. Over that period of 30 years, we had a population just of 1.5 million, 47,000 injuries, 37,000 shootings, 22,000 armed robberies, 30,000 people went through our penal system, and with almost 4,000 deaths. Those statistics probably seem tiny to many people's minds, but often when I'm in the United States, I extrapolate those figures. So very simply put, if the Northern Ireland conflict had happened in the United States over a 30-year period, you would have had 700,000 dead, 6 million political prisoners, 9 million injuries, 7 million shootings, and 3 million bombings. Let me just talk a little about the kind of Good Friday Agreement. And I've often used the work of the late Jonathan Sacks, who was the chief rabbi, as many of you know, to the British Commonwealth. Sacks had this brilliant quotation where he said, "Weapons win wars, but it takes ideas to win peace." Weapons win wars, but it takes ideas to win peace. The word reconciliation that Dmitry has alluded to there is a kind of feel-good word, it seems at times. And yet I've often argued that reconciliation is anything but feel-good. A theologian of another generation said, reconciliation is no cheap matter. It does not come about by simply papering over deep-seated differences. Reconciliation presupposes confrontation. Without that, we do not get reconciliation, but merely a temporary glossing over of differences. So the running sores of society cannot be healed with the use of a band-aid or a sticking plaster. Because reconciliation, I want to suggest, presupposes an operation, a cutting to the very bone without anesthetic or anesthesia, because the infection is not just on the surface. So I've often argued over the years, or tried to develop a theory that I call a multidisciplinary approach to building peace. Because many people work on the assumption that if we get a legal framework, all will be well. We get an agreement, set up certain institutions politically, that all will be well. As a colleague of mine said in relation to the law, I mean, the law cannot heal. Law is not a therapy. The law can create a space. The reality is that law and fact are weak when you're dealing with powerful emotions. So I want to say, in relation to what I call a multidisciplinary approach to peace, you need academics at the table. You need business people, you need politicians, you need women's groups, but you need all our various academic disciplines. You need philosophy, you need history, you need psychology, you need theologians, all feeding into that space. The biggest thing we're dealing with at the moment, 26 years, as Dmitry has said, after the end of our conflict, is the role of legacy, memory. How do we get the architecture to deal with the past? As a colleague of mine rightly alluded to, he said, if truth is the first casualty of war, as it is, perspective is often the first casualty of peace. So how do we deal with memory? I mean, I've often suggested there's a danger of too much memory. Memory also, naturally, we all know this, tends to be very, very selective. But furthermore, memory can be manipulated. I actually did a project that my colleague Dmitry's were off with the social psychology department at Tel Aviv, where we twinned British Irish victims with Israeli Palestinian victims over a period of time. And we tried to look at what we were calling deep remembering. How do we remember in a less destructive way? And it came out of an article that a colleague of mine, a professor there at Tel Aviv University, Nurit, wrote in her Ritz entitled Inclusive Victimhood versus Competitive Victimhood. It's interesting, how do we explode in reconciliation what I call myths and stereotypes? The brilliant Israeli diplomat Ben-Ami said that collective psychology, national myths, and the perception that a given group might have of its enemy have always been major factors in the decision to go to war. So stories are not just historical stories. They're stories that shape our spiritual health, our mental health, our internal and our external psychology, and ultimately the way we behave and the way we actually think. So I want to suggest that one of the key components to our peace process has been creating what we call once upon a time moments. I mean, science has long proven that storytelling is one of the most effective mechanisms for dealing with the past. Let me just highlight for a couple of moments, because time's slipping on, a process that was developed by a close friend of mine, a leading psychologist at Queen's University, called the civic society peace process, or the social peace process, versus the political peace process. Good Friday Agreement is signed 26 years ago, April the 10th, 1998. Our devolved assembly has been down, not functioning, 44% of the time. I mean, it's literally just up, as you guys know. I mean, most of the world's news sources pick that up. It's just up after another 2 year where it was put again into hibernation. People often ask me, Gary, if you haven't had a government for 44% of the time, why have you not gone back to conflict? And I've often said quite strongly that, to my mind, that civic society is actually the social glue that holds our peace process together. Because the theory goes like this. Politicians work in the assumption that the negotiated settlement, everything is done and dusted. I mean, let's be honest, there's few of any negotiated settlements deal with what I call social healing, social relationship building, civic society repair, replacement of brokenness by the development of tolerance and compromises. So we need a social peace process that includes truth and reconciliation procedures, forgiveness and atonement strategies, public tolerance, memorialization, remembering, cultural systems, flags, re-evaluation of identity. The problem in most negotiations, as has been rightly pointed out, is that they are either ignored by negotiators or they work on the assumption that they will flow naturally from the signing of the agreement itself. I think it's a pretty naive assumption that once you sort out problematic politics, societal healing automatically occurs. And in reality, the day the Good Friday Agreement was signed, way back April 10th, 1998, George Michal, the American Democratic senator from Maine, in a throwaway comment, which was incredibly true and prophetic, said, if you think getting this agreement was difficult, and it was, implementing it will be even more difficult. So as I sit here in Belfast today at 1 p.m, I've been meeting with colleagues from the Irish government looking at the ongoing implementation of the Good Friday Agreement. Because if you focus just on the political peace process, the domain is naturally political, governments, political actors. But if you realize there is a social peace process and need for healing within society, peace processes become the responsibility of people like me and others who live in societies emerging out of conflict and the domain in which they function. So in reality, in the early 1990s, and I'll pick a couple of sentences and then finish, in the early 1990s, after killing each other for 22, 23 years, we ended up with a mutually hurting stalemate. So very simply put, the British Army, one of the most efficient military machines on planet Earth, were not going to defeat the IRA, non-state actors. The IRA were never going to defeat the British Army. And the non-state actors on the pro-British side, Ulster Volunteer Force, Ulster Defence Association, were not going to defeat the IRA. So there wasn't going to be any outright military victory. We could have killed each other for another 50 years. Colonel Gaddafi had sent in tons of weaponry to the IRA. The loyalist groupings had obtained weaponry from South Africa. So there's enough weaponry in the island of Ireland to continue this thing for another 50 years. So what were the things, just very, very briefly, that I'll highlight, and then I'll pass over to my next colleague. I've got 1,000 Israelis and Palestinians in Belfast in the last 10 years. And they often highlight to me, not me to them, 5 lessons very quickly. They do highlight naturally that political leadership is essential to achieving peace. The leaders on both sides of the political divide took thoughtful strategic risks. They said that change was preferable to the status quo. The second thing was there was a desire to break the continuous cycle of violence and save future generation from the horrors of conflict that emerged. Every Israeli and Palestinian has said to me in Belfast and Dublin, and I've had all shades of opinion, the Likud, Arab Joint List, Jewish Home, academics, women's groups, NGOs. They all said, Gary, you're not getting this. You don't understand. Israelis and Palestinians don't trust each other. And I go, really? Do you really think the first time in the late 80s when some of us went into a room, like we were hugging each other, we were popping bottles of champagne, we hated each other? But you cannot continually use this excuse of not trusting the other person as an excuse for not beginning the process. Fourth thing I highlight is that all our attempts to resolve the conflict through military force were ultimately futile. And they didn't result in lasting security for either community. How did we achieve real security? When dialogue was prioritized, but most importantly, the root causes of the conflict were addressed. And the fifth and final lesson that colleagues in the Middle East say to me is the role of civic society, the social peace process. And that's why really the MEPA fund that was set up there in the United States was modeled on the International Fund for Ireland. I think statistically and financially, $16 has been put into the Israeli-Palestinian region for every person living there. $16. For the Northern Irish peace process, it's something like $80. The investment we had in our peace process was phenomenal. Europe, the United States, billions of dollars were put into this space to what I say to break up the hardened soil of sectarianism and hatred to allow meaningful human engagement to begin. Look, I'm over my 15 minutes. I'm conscious of time, but I know we have a discussion later and we can drill into some of those concepts in a bit more detail.
Well, our next speaker is Dr. Or Avi-Guy, formerly a postdoc at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And please, Or, you take this, right?
Hi, everyone, and thank you for having me here. Today, I'm going to discuss the impact of structural settings on top-down apologies and acknowledgement of wrongdoing. And I'm going to first discuss in a nutshell the issue of apologies in the context or the framework of transitional justice. And then I'm going to try and investigate how those issues come to fruition or are implemented in two different contexts. One is in power sharing context, and of course, totally relevant to the case of Northern Ireland, but also to other areas in the world, and also in ongoing conflicts. So, fun subject, never mind. It's important to first establish what is a state apology from a transitional justice perspective. It's a symbolic form of reparation, at times combined with compensation and other types of reparations. It provides recognition for wrongs suffered by the victims and by victimized communities, an acknowledgement of the pain they had endured. This element also links it to truth-telling in transitional justice. It also provides for an accountability measure for the perpetrator, linking it to the right to justice. And it addresses past wrongdoing, but often is forward-looking. Apologies, a lot of the times, and acknowledgements of wrongdoing have in their wording, attempts to create some sort of a clean slate, drawing a line between the wrongs of the past and the future, and message of moving forward, which is also linked to the issue of non-recurrence. So this symbolic form of reparation is actually linked to other aspects of the transitional process. In the literature, apologies are seen as an important but insufficient measure on their own in addressing the past, much like other measures that when are implemented out of context, their impact is not full. It is a climactic moment, a speech act that seeks forgiveness, and also not just in the feel-good social way, but also in a very concrete political terms. And official apologies are usually part of a broader transitional process and are implemented alongside or as a continuation of previous measures. And we will discuss it in two examples that I will later on give. Importantly, official apologies tend to be limited to a defined or a specific type of harm, a specific incident, event, or specific policy in the broader context of broader conflict. Usually is those events or policies are ones that are fully concluded in the past. There is an important element of the passage of time that facilitates the emergence of a movement towards an apology or this political moment of an official apology. And there's a lot of a political need to create this space or this distance in terms of the political makeup of the apologizer versus the one that enacted those wrongdoings, and also in terms of the time lapse between the events for which we're apologizing and the current reality of the situation. When trying to analyze apologies top-down, it's important that we evaluate different aspects of the apology and in the context of the broader transitional justice process. One is the transitional settings. Apologies are impacted by the type of transition that we're discussing. Post-conflict transitional processes or traditional transitional justice is one setting in which there is a greater possibility of apologies. There's more space for it as opposed to transitional justice in ongoing conflict. But we've seen a lot of cases of apologies in transitional justice, actually without transition, in cases of established democracies that are taking responsibility and apologizing for policies without a transitional process as we're used to seeing it in the form of a change of the political system and the entire regime. It's also important to know or understand the circumstances in which apologies are given following political pressure, other apologies that took place before, either in the specific case and context of this apology or in other regions of the world. Does it happen alongside other forms of reparations or as a result of legal processes and other forms of investigation or following a change of government? It's important to analyze the scope of the apology itself. Are we discussing an apology for a single event or a policy, or are we also addressing the broader social political settings and the culture that led to the wrongdoing to begin with? And how does this apology contribute to non-recurrence? Is it accompanied by a policy or institutional change, a change in legislation, changes to the educational system, to reforms in security forces, etc.? I want to also, since we're discussing apologies in the context of transitional justice, to note the importance of the roles of victims and victimized communities in the apology, understanding that direct victims and victimized communities don't always share the same interests or needs when it comes to formal apologies, and also that victimized communities are not necessarily homogeneous. And therefore might have different perspectives within the community vis-a-vis that apology. But are they given a voice during the act of apologizing or acknowledgement? Are they active participants? Is there any element of ownership, for example, and acceptance of the official apology by the community to which it is offered? And the last point that I think that is important when we try to understand how can we facilitate, or what are the settings that are required for successful apology and acknowledgement of wrongdoing from the top down, are the political incentives and the goals of the apologizers, not necessarily vis-a-vis the specific traumatized or victimized community, but the broader general audience and the broader public. Apologizers sometimes want to distance themselves from previous governments or from their political opposition. They want to remove the stain for their own political past, not just as a historical measure, but as a specific attempt to change the reputation of their own political movement or party, or the attempt to justify or normalize other forms of wrongdoing by exclusion, because if a lot of apologies are only limited to a specific event or incident, it leaves other policies, incidents, forms of neglect and wrongdoing unaddressed in the general perspective of the conflict. So keeping that in mind, I want to move on to look at apologies in the context of power sharing. Post-conflict power sharing governments often struggle to promote political reconciliation from the top down, and apologies and acknowledgement of wrongdoing is a specific form of such measures. And also because, as we've seen, because it's a very broad one touching upon other transitional justice elements, it's a particularly difficult gesture or move for governments to make. In transitional, in power sharing context, there are specific structural and political disincentives that emerge in terms of trying to promote such initiatives. One is the issue of ethnic voting patterns, and the other one is the issue of ethnic outbidding, with an added consequence of the marginalization of cross-ethnic and moderate parties. So I will address first the first one. Ethnic voting patterns and political reconciliation emerge in ethnicity-based political systems that are in which there is a ethnic designation in some form and in some level to the political parties and their representatives. In a lot of the cases, a cycle of hostility emerges in which there is already a divided society or an ethno-national voter base. And therefore, the ethno-national parties that emerge in that political structure resort to very divisive rhetoric and policy ideas in order to rally support from that voter base voter bases that are very antagonistic to each other. That perpetuates or feeds into that already existing ethnic voting patterns, and as a result of the cycle, conflict patterns are perpetuated within the political system. This phenomena is complemented by the issue of ethnic outbidding, in which political competition is within and not between the ethno-national blocs, with each party tries to present itself as the defender of its own community, not trying to convince voters on policy issues, but rather to portray themselves as the one that will best serve the interest of a specific ethnic community. In that settings, a lot of the times parties cater to the extremes or adopt a more hard line in order to be seen as more protective of that group's interest. And cross-ethnic and moderate parties struggle in elections and are pushed aside in the political system because they don't fit to that cycle that I've outlined before. That means that post-conflict apologies in power sharing and ethnicity-based political systems is extremely complex. When ethno-national identities are entrenched, there's an absence of an overarching multifaceted civil identity, and the electoral success is based on social division. In these cases, there are political disincentives that impede top-down political reconciliation initiatives, including apologies and official acknowledgement of state wrongdoing. But I want to show, to still discuss a case in which there was an apology in power sharing settings, and that is the case of the Bloody Sunday apology in 2010 by British Prime Minister David Cameron, who apologized for the massacre in Derry on Bloody Sunday in 1972, in which British soldiers shot 26 unarmed Catholic civilians during a protest in Derry, with 14 dead, some of which were fleeing, some of which were helping the wounded. As I said, apologies usually don't take place in a vacuum. They happen alongside other transitional methods. There were two investigations. The original British investigation, British government investigation after the incident largely cleared British soldiers and authorities from responsibility for that incident. But later on, the civil inquiry in 2018 that published its report in 2010 described the killing as unjustified and unjustifiable. And on the day of the report being published, that was the day of Cameron's apology. Again, this is an apology for a specific event in the long history of the Troubles, a very symbolic, a very central event, but an isolated one. And it was made possible largely because it was external to the power-sharing political system in Northern Ireland itself, and was linked to other measures, the investigation, and also a criminal police persecution following the publication of this report. So if in power-sharing settings, dealing and apologizing for the past is complex due to the lingering patterns of the political and lingering patterns of conflict in the political and social spheres, it is even more difficult and problematic when the conflict is very much present. There is often a debate whether apology or acknowledgement of wrongdoing in ongoing conflict is a trust-building measure, or is it a type of concession outside of negotiations? The structural and political impediments that exist in the context of power sharing in terms of the conflict dynamics are on steroids in ongoing conflict, in the sense that the political divide is even greater and more pronounced than in power sharing settings, and the need to appear as protective of your community and making no concession to the other side is even more pronounced. But there are also very strategic and pragmatic reasons why in such settings apologies are difficult, and that's because they might have a direct impact, or there is a concern that they will have a direct impact on negotiations and resolution attempts and legal implications to admission of guilt, in the sense that it means that you are conceding to the narrative of the other side, and also have to make certain measures due to that accountability that you're taking on yourself. It means that whatever you gained in conflict as a result of that wrongdoing, now that you're apologizing for it, you also need to correct it in terms of the attempts to resolve the conflict. So that brings about the question of non-recurrence. Is there even a space for an apology when ongoing violence still persists? And also in this case, I would like to share with you a case study of an apology that took place in the context of ongoing conflict, and that is the Kfar Qasim massacre of 1956, where Israeli border police killed 48 Arab civilians and one unborn baby in Kfar Qasim, which is located within the Green Line. While they were returning from to the village during a curfew of which they did not know, they were unaware. This issue was investigated. There was a trial in which the soldiers involved were found guilty and sentenced to prison, but later their sentences were reduced and they received presidential pardons. All of them were released within 3 years after the incident. But that trial basically was the first time that the issue of blatantly illegal order was addressed, and soldiers were required to disobey such orders. In addition to the legal criminal proceedings, a year after the massacre, there was a sulhamil, a public attempt at a form of traditional reconciliation, but it was very heavily criticized, and reports or comments on that attempt basically conclude that villagers were very much pressured to participate in a governmental attempt to move over from that incident. During the years, Israeli leaders and politicians addressed the issue with attempts by Yossi Sarid and Yuli Tamir to introduce the matter into the education system and include it in schools' curriculum. But importantly, there were 3 apologies or attempted apologies or some sort of acknowledgement of wrongdoing by Israeli presidents. The first one was in 2007 when President Peres visited the village for Eid al-Adha and said he was sorry for the massacre. In 2014, President Rivlin, which actually included that as part of his presidential election campaign, attended the annual remembrance and commemoration ceremony, and that was it was not, he did not specifically offer a formal apology, but that was his first time being present there and discussing the event, mentioning that it was wrong. And in 2021, just recently, President Herzog attended the annual ceremony, being the second president to do such a thing, and he asked officially forgiveness on behalf of himself and the state of Israel. Importantly, that very year and around the time of that apology, the Knesset voted down a bill for official recognition of the massacre, which included the classification of documents related to the massacre and also including it again in the education system. So what we see again is that it is part of a more complex process and with multiple measures of transitional justice involved in order to finally reach some sort of an official apology. At the same time, there is still a disagreement among the Knesset about official recognition of that same event. So it's a single event in the past with the passage of time, and still the attempts to fully come to terms with it and officially recognize it are problematic. And that leads me to my conclusions that there are multiple factors that impact state apologies and acknowledgement of wrongdoing. One is the political incentives and disincentives and the political costs of a formal apology, which also depend on the structure of the political system. The second one is conflict patterns and the dynamics in which it is difficult to make concessions and take responsibility in the absence of trust or when without the proper time and political distance from the event. And the last one is the transitional settings and circumstances. And we see that in power sharing settings and in ongoing conflicts, those issues are a lot more complex than they are in established democracies when there's no big political shift, but coming to terms with the past is made easier. And I want to just say something, because I focused only on the top-down elements, but in a lot of cases, the apologies, they don't the discussion is not made fully just on the political sphere, and that interaction, that back and forth, that public pressure and the dialogue with civil society and bottom-up movements is very important in creating the settings in which such an apology is made more possible. So despite the focus on the many structural and political challenges and impediments, it's important to maintain that dialogue with civil society and with the public in order to create that space and the possibility of such a measure to be taken. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. As I understand that there's probably sometimes there's an urge to say sorry, but from a moral point of view, from a humane point of view, but it doesn't mean that it's easy. We don't operate in a vacuum. There are numerous circumstances which either alter or ease this saying sorry, and it doesn't. There must be we must also look at the consequences and at the exact conditions. So our discussion today, starting with Gary and now Or, and I will give the floor to Michal, is we're turning around the different components, and we're turning around the different components and the different factors influencing negotiations and reconciliation. And we're talking about what comes first. Should things be dealt at the same time, or there's a sequence of events? We have to start with something and then move on. And I think that Michal's report is about the historical acknowledgements, whether it eases the negotiations.
Thank you. No, doesn't work. I'll do this. Okay. First of all, I want to thank Max and Dmitry for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here back in Tel Aviv. It's a deja vu for me because I went to the political science department here in Tel Aviv and they changed my life and they told me that I should go get a PhD in America. So it literally changed my life. So I'm really excited to be back here. I'm a political scientist, and I mostly study international norms of transitional justice. And I'm really delighted to come after Or, who prepared the ground, so all the definitions are out there. I don't have to do those in my presentation. In this paper, there has been a widespread, almost consensus, that among conflict resolution practitioners and scholars, that there are indeed long-term positive effects for what we call dealing with the past by historical acknowledgement. Historical acknowledgements are practices that attempt to come to terms with historical grievances, usually following violations of human rights, in non-monetary means. So, and the argument, so they are assumed to lessen the effects of contested history. They assume to lead to reconciliation. We discussed a lot of reconciliation here. They assume to utter regret and build together, foster a better future. This article actually flips the arguments and actually says that they're not only useful if and when they lead to reconciliation. I would leave that as an open question, if they lead to reconciliation. But because we think they lead to reconciliation, they're actually quite useful in early stages of conflict negotiations. So in a way, people don't like those, the reconciliation people don't like to say that there is instrumental use of those strategies. But it relates to the historian presentation we had in a previous panel, that there are actually quite pragmatic solutions in negotiation settings. What they do, they address the long-term distrust, which is usually an underlying cause that hinders negotiations, and they provide what we call in conflict resolution literature positive costly signals, and I explain soon what they are. So this is the argument, and what I argue that this argument was not always true. It's true specifically time because in the current international environment, we actually have what we call a normative international environment that supports those measures, that supports the introduction of human rights concerns and transitional justice concerns into negotiation. Just think about what's happening now with the Palestinian and the human rights discourse of genocide in the current conflict. Okay, so this discourse of human rights is very much part of our conflict now. Okay, so this is actually a published paper which is made of two things. It's made of theory development, which I built on models of conflict resolution and conflict transformation literature, and on models of negotiations. And then on the empirical side, I do what I call a feasibility study of the Israeli-Palestinian context, specifically the issue of the 1948 Nakba. In this presentation today, I will focus only on the theoretical model of the theory development. So, transitional justice, presented, we have a field of study of transitional justice, which refers to a range of practices that address the negative psychological, social, and political effects of past injustices. These include trials, human rights trials, reparation programs, Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That we have a whole toolkit of what we call transitional justice practices that attempt to address the legacy of human rights violations. In the literatures, transitional justice practices have been associated with multiple positive effects. Like in social sciences language, the dependent variable were many. It promotes democracy, it promotes reconciliation, it promotes peace building, it promotes, there's numerous dissertations, all of them show a different dependent variable. Historical acknowledgement strategies are a subset of transitional justice, and they refer to the non-monetary means or the non-retributive means, which means we exclude trials, we exclude reparations, and we focus mostly on truth and reconciliation commissions, like the one in South Africa, for example, that ended apartheid in the mid-90s. Historical narrative revisions, for example, what has been done in Germany, the fact that every German student has to study in the curriculum the history and the legacy of the Holocaust in history in schools in Germany, official apologies, as was described here, and public commemoration. So basically changing the environment in a way that commemorates it. So think about the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, for example, that commemorates the Holocaust, and think other things, basically renaming spaces, creating national memorial holidays. All those things are part of historical acknowledgements strategies. Now, in the conflict resolution, going to the conflict resolution literature, there is this idea that indeed adversaries usually tell the history differently. Reverend Mason just mentioned the diverging narratives of the Irish conflict. We call it the War of Independence. Palestinians call it the Nakba. So the diverging. So sometimes even the contested history itself becomes a significant obstacle to peace and conflict. Just think about, what is Crimea? Is it Russian? Is it Ukrainian? They're fighting over the history of that in a way. Furthermore, there's this idea that distorted self-glorifying narratives also shape perceptions and intentions of threat. So the studies show the more the there is a distorted view of history, there is more threat perception among adversaries. So basically, in the conflict resolution literature, the idea was that historical acknowledgement strategies have the capacity to produce a joint narrative and therefore to legitimize peace agreements and to legitimize living together in peace. The conflict transformation literature has been even more specific and suggesting a more substantive role to historical acknowledgement. And what they argue is that it vindicates victim. It alleviates their sense of being hurt. It's a means to kind of create trust, respect, cooperation. So basically, for example, the one example that is really given is the Belfast Agreement in 1998. So basically, that in the agreement there was those clauses about peace building measures that will transform the conflict. Yes, we agreed, we achieved the political agreement, but now we have to move forward into achieving a societal agreement, and that will be by reconciliation. So both in conflict resolution and conflict transformation literature, these practices and strategies have been typically associated with a bottom-up process and left to the domain of civil society. So this idea was that, yes, even in the example we saw in the previous panel about those German-French exchange program, it was this idea that after the rapprochement between Germany and France, there will be these exchanges in the education system, and they will build friendship between the German people and the French people. We saw that in the previous. In fact, conflict resolution experts often said, leave it to the later stages, because if we will raise those issues of history at the beginning of negotiation, it might lead to a backlash, an opposition. Instead of fighting about the agreement, we will fight about the Nakba. So let's just not discuss that and move it to later. Okay, so overall, it was usually discussed in post-conflict peace building, basically by civil society, and often assumes some level of political closure as a precondition. So as I said, I would like to change that, to change the timing and the level of analysis, what we call, and basically focus it as a short-term negotiation dynamic, and focus it as negotiation strategy by the negotiating leadership. So yes, there is some recent literature, especially on what we call during conflict justice, which really talks about what does that mean to introduce them during negotiations. And there's a lot of the talk about, indeed, the mutual recognition. So the theme still persists, that the focus is on the psychological, what we call emotive effects of mutual recognition. This idea that it will have some kind of a psychological effect, so basically lead to some kind of transformation of identity. Okay, I would argue that you don't even need to focus on identities. Okay, just focus on the dynamic, little micro dynamic of a negotiation. And this comes from models of negotiations that are strategies of positive inducements. So basically, the argument says that even if you, as an actor in negotiation, initiate unilateral, some kind of positive measures, they tend to be reciprocated. So it is in your benefit, if you're a negotiator, to show some kind of positive measure in your approach. And so basically it comes from this idea that you can try and move the negotiation from a zero-sum game to a positive-sum game. I can offer you more things. And in this way, actually, historical acknowledgement strategies are becoming a new trade-off, something that I bring to the table. I will educate all the students in my school system, my public school system, in your history. Think about it, I'll give an example. Think about the outroar here in Israel recently about UNRWA and about the content of textbooks teaching malicious images of Israelis, okay? So think about the commitment for an Palestinian curriculum which teaches the legacy of the Holocaust. Okay. So basically, and commit for that in your negotiation process. There will be something you put to the table, you offer as a concession, okay? And it's not something so far-fetched. We've seen those examples actually in many places. In South Africa during negotiation, we all like to look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa as a miraculous way which prevented violence and ended apartheid. But if you go and look at the micro foundation of negotiations, it was a political compromise. Basically, the ANC wanted a trial. De Klerk said, no way. And there was like actors from outside which came and offered this idea, okay, we'll do this quasi legal thing which does nothing, but it will do a lot of reconciliation. Okay, so we have extension. We have the Good Friday Agreement, as I mentioned earlier, and we have the Lom Peace Accord in Sierra Leone, which ended the civil war in Sierra Leone in a similar way. During the negotiation, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was proposed as a concession as part of negotiation. So we do have a support for that. Another thing which we do is, well, we can look at that as addressing the problem of trust and costly signals. So that's another way that strategies work. So I mentioned the unilateral reciprocity. The other thing is what we call the signaling hypothesis. And this is a very common hypothesis in negotiation models in political international relations, not of historical justice, but in general. The idea is that negotiations are very high risk, low information, incomplete information environment. The actors kind of hold the cards close to the heart, so it's very little information going there. So the question is, and you have two actors that really distrust each other. Think about it. They're in a conflict, they're killing each other. So, okay, so what can you do in this situation? So our argument here is that historical acknowledgements are signals of commitment for long-term coexistence. I'm telling you now, listen, I'm going to change my textbook. I'm going to build you commemoration sites for your Nakba. I'm going to build you, so you can provide weapons to Israel, but you can also, I'm going to go to the Warsaw Ghetto and kneel down and apologize. Adenauer. So, yes. So think about those signals of historical acknowledgement. And these signals actually follow what we see in the signaling theories. They are a way to tie your hands. So, for example, a signal will be more costly if you can reassure the other side that it's not going to be changeable so easily. Tying your hands. So the way to do that, as I said, is with long-term commitments of this kind. We also know from the studies that positive signals are actually more effective than negative ones. So basically, carrots are more effective than sticks, usually in those kinds of negotiations. So historical acknowledgement strategies are basically an endorsement of public commitment to accept and acknowledge the other. And this commitment really is profound, because if you tell that you're going to teach your kids the history of their adversary, you're basically telling them that you're creating a generational change for the future. So it's the most commitment that you can actually signal to the other side. It's also a way to reduce threat and to provide a diplomatic mechanism to build trust. And we actually have quite a lot of example for that. And in my research, I just found it really interesting that Japan, for example, did incorporate, which we often say that Japan is the non-apologizing state. So she usually compared to Germany in negation, because they did not apologize for the war crimes during World War II. But actually, during the micro negotiations in 1956 with Korea, Japanese-Korean normalization agreement, there was elements of regret and apology in the negotiations. So, and the same was true in the 1970s in the Sino-Japanese Peace Partnership Treaty. So we see this kind of dynamic. Two last points. So the one counter argument is is it really costly if you just say, I'm sorry, or apologize, or are they really costly, or they're just cheap talk, basically? So I would actually go here on the negative argument here, and I said, think about how countries cares about their historical narrative. To what extent they go not to acknowledge their past crimes of human rights. Think about Turkey and the Armenian genocide. Think about Japan and the comfort women, the sexual assault of women. Think about Austria, that for years had this really strict denial of their being part of the German Nazi machine. So basically, think about countries really care about their history. So my argument is, if they really care, then their signaling of doing the other way will be indeed a costly signal. One last thing to consider is the audience costs. So one of the things in negotiation is that it could be really costly to apologize for past crimes of human rights violation. It's costly because you can have a backlash from your own population that doesn't want to do that. It's costly because it can be a moral hazard. So basically, this idea that it signals weakness rather than resolve, and we want to signal resolve in negotiation. And the third, my argument is that these are all true for problems of negotiations. However, historical acknowledgement strategies sometimes are mitigated in those audience costs. And especially, one thing is, in many societies, the history is not really unknown. The history is there. There are academics that have been studying that. So, for example, when President Clinton apologized for Japanese internment during World War II in camps in the United States, it didn't come out of the blue. It came after years of academics publishing books about those camps and everything. So there was knowledge in society. So I would argue that there's not always such a backlash as we would anticipate that there is, because the information is available out there. And the second reason that audience cost is mitigated is what I talked about, the international normative environment and its expectation and incentive. So we find in the literature a lot of studies now that in the last 20 years, we have what we call this global historical justice regime, or this idea of norms of dealing with the past. And not only do we have it, they're very commonly entering almost any peace negotiation that is going on around the world. So almost in any peace negotiations, this idea of acknowledging history is entering negotiations. So what this creates is expectations. But I would argue it's not only creating expectations, it's also creating incentives. Because now you can actually get not just identity loss from acknowledging your past history of human rights violation, but you actually can have an international identity gain. I am the country that acknowledges the wrong I've done. Think about Germany and the social capital they have gained by acknowledging their past history. So it actually can add to prestige and reputation and to legitimize the peace agreement. So in conclusion, I would argue that beyond this idea of kumbaya and the wolf lives with the sheep, that might happen with all those historical acknowledgement strategies, what I offer is a pragmatic approach that supports the application of historical acknowledgement in the micro-negotiation strategies. I don't think they should be left for civil society. They should be encouraged by the use of leadership in very early stages of the negotiation. Thank you.
Michal, thank you very much. A lot to think about. I think maybe during the third panel we'll also have time to return to some questions. I mean, what you said at the end, introducing historical acknowledgements into pushing them into official negotiations. That's the role of a leader. And the question arises, does the leader has to listen to public opinion and obey, or he should push the agenda? It's an open question. My first question is to you, Michal, and to you, Or. Michal, you just said about Clinton recognizing the war prisoners, Japanese war prisoners. This acknowledgement took place when there was an avalanche, practically, of political leaders, right, saying sorry. My question to you and to Or, was this due to a certain time? Has this period stopped? Can we expect something more? Because all the famous statements were coincided in time at the end of starting probably from the start of the 90s and up till the year 2000. Do you think it's a question? What is it a question of what?
I think that a lot of it has to do with the identity of the apologizer and the context in which the apology is given. A lot of those apologies are in the context of established democracies that are coming to terms with specific chapters in their past. And once they deal with the chapters in the past, with the specific incidents or policies that they feel comfortable addressing, or that there's the political possibility of addressing. After the apology, for example, in the late 1990s of the Canadian Prime Minister Harper, he apologized for the practice of Indigenous boarding schools, residential schools in Canada. But his apology was incomplete in the sense that he didn't apologize for those practices in specific territories and regions that were left out of the original class action suit that preceded the apology, that was part of a whole legal process, and because they weren't at the time under the direct authority of the Canadian federal government at the time. So Trudeau, later in the 2000, and I think it was 7 or something like that, he apologized for the specific schools and communities that were left out of the original apology after another class action suit and litigation and monetary reparations that were given to those communities. So this back and forth between different elements of the transitional process and the political settings that enable that apology are important. The Harper apology was a result, to an extent, of public pressure, other processes, but also the apology for not dissimilar practices in the stolen generation in Australia a year before, when Kevin Rudd, then Prime Minister, promised that he will do that on his first session of the Parliament, as he did, and then the pressure on Harper grew. So it's as long as the issue of public apologies for past wrongdoing continues on additional issues, additional practices, additional policies, additional incidents, it will continue. But without public pressure, no leader likes to just voluntarily offer an apology because of the political cost that he may face.
And at that certain time, there was enormous public pressure, right?
For specific policies in specific settings.
Because it was worldwide, very, very...
in established democracies.
Yeah, I will take a zoom out for that. So I agree with you. What we have, the emergence of transitional justice practices start in the late 90s into 2000s. And it starts, I would actually think, I'm not sure it was a lot of pressure. My explanation would be more about a lot of entrepreneurial politics. So basically, people who followed what we call the fourth wave of democratization, which is the post-Cold War waves of democratization. And they were professional transitional justicer who went from many areas of conflict around the world and proposed apologies, truth commissions. So in a different study that I do, I show very clearly the path you have, a truth commission emerging in the 70s, going in a very small path, regular path, and then you have a spike after the South African Truth Commission, and we have up to the data set of Truth Commission today is about 50 Truth Commissions that have been operating, some in established democracies, some in transitioning. Most of them are failing, but they're still being practiced. So to your question, yes, it starts clearly fourth wave of democracy after Cold War, but in my opinion, even now it seems that it's kind of declined. It's actually there because it's part of the toolkit of the UN. The UN has a transitional justice toolkit, which they bring to every conflict around the world now. The International Center of Transitional Justice, a non-governmental organization established in early 2000s, is one of the leading conflict resolutions organization now around the world. So they go from conflict to conflict and they propose those toolkits to the politicians on the ground.
Thank you. Yeah, Gary, maybe you also would like to comment on my question, whether there was what's the reason for such a tight timing? And another question specifically to Northern Ireland. You started your speech saying you extrapolated the victims and the victims of Northern Ireland to the United States situation, and we heard that you're speaking about millions of people in terms of casualties, and it's a lot. And yes, it pushes people to do something about it, but still. What if we would get into the mind of the British, Irish, American politicians who dealt with the situation? What would you, from a moral point of view, from a humane point of view, what would you say were, again, as with the private entrepreneurs, what was the driving force behind them? I mean, they had their own business. They could do, they could continue with their own business, with their own political agenda in their respective countries and not deal with Northern Ireland. What was the factor which influenced them the most?
A lot of it, Dmitry. I'll take the second question first. I mean, looking at the early 90s, it was simply the theory of the role of third parties in resolving conflict. In 1985, we had the Anglo-Irish Agreement between the UK and the Irish government. We needed, and people in my community, I grew up in that British Unionist community, went ballistic because they saw this outside interference. That was 85. Then Downing Street Declaration. And then there was a statement by a British politician, Peter Brooke, who was British Secretary of State, in the most obscure dinner in London, nothing to do with politics. It was like the Steelworkers' Dinner, where he said this here. As a British government, we have no economic, selfish or strategic interest in Northern Ireland. It is not against a united Ireland we set our face, but against the means that the IRA are using, namely terrorism or political violence, to pursue that. That began to change the dynamic, where a politician was basically indirectly, I guess, Michal, apologising for the past, or British colonialism worldwide. So what they were really saying to those within the IRA Republican movement was that we're not there for economic strategic interests. And if a new dispensation politically comes about, we will not stop it. In other words, they were saying, pursue your political goals not through armed struggle, but through politics. So the third parties thing is interesting, and I know we're not going to drill into the Israeli-Palestinian theater at the moment, but I did say to a colleague, actually Michal, in the State Department a few weeks ago, when you look at tiny, tiny Northern Ireland, 1.6 million people, we needed the Americans, we needed the Canadians, we needed the Australians, we needed the Europeans to help us get over the line. So I was just suggesting, once the war is over, the day after, as is used in the Middle East, the phraseology at the moment, what is the role of the international community? Because we were not capable of dealing with this for ourselves. We were traumatized, both Israelis and Palestinians. I mean, I'm in the region a lot. As I said, about 1,000 Israelis and Palestinians. Of conversations mostly with colleagues in the Middle East. Both Israelis and Palestinians are incredibly traumatized. As we were traumatized in the early 1990s after decades of neighbor killing neighbor. We needed outsider. And as you said, Dmitry, this place is not utopia. But the life my kids have now is phenomenally different to the life that I am in relation to that. Looking just at the second question, just to respond to Or and Michal's comments there. I mean, I will never do a PhD at my age, it's impossible, but I keep saying to students, honestly, or Michal, I would look at the role of memory in conflict transformation. How we actually deal with memory and the power of story. I mean, David Reef, the New York journalist book there that you know, called In Praise of Forgetting, and he's not talking about what he calls shameful amnesia. But he wrote a brilliant article in The Guardian, so anyone is listening, and this is free if you don't want to buy the book. It's called The Cult of Memory, When History Does More Harm Than Good. The Cult of Memory, When History Does More Harm Than Good. So, in our space at the moment, 26 years after the Good Friday Agreement, we are still weaponizing history. When I have Israelis or Palestinians there, they see paintings, as I often say, of what the other side did to us, never what we did to them. So how do we deal in this process with weaponizing history? Just to address Michal's point there as well, in the Good Friday Agreement, to a degree, we minimize the whole concept of transitional justice, or minimize legacy, or minimize dealing with the past. I understand the reasons. Trying to get these politicians over the line was not easy. We had to deal with weapons decommissioning, we had to deal with reform of policing, we had to deal with release of prisoners. So as you know, Michal, or the kind of legacy thing got pushed down the road. Another reason there, Dmitry, just to say that apologies were issued. 1994, the Combined Lawless Military Command, terrorist non-state actors used the phrase, "We express abject and true remorse to all innocent victims of the conflict." The IRA in 2002 followed it up, again using the phrase, "all innocent victims of the conflict." Now the reason for that being was, at that stage, we were still just not even out of conflict in 94, but by 2002 there was some optimism. Remember, when terrorist groups move off the stage, they have a very difficult dance in keeping their spoilers or detractors on board. So if they come out too quickly with apologies, particularly against police and British Army that they killed, they're going to empower or give a second wind to those who think the decision was wrong to go into politics in the first place. So it's a very delicate dance in relation to that. So you don't want to empower the kind of purest psychopathic terrorists when you do these apologies. So there's a timing issue there as well. But I do take Michal's point there that if that had been built into the Good Friday Agreement, perhaps we wouldn't be having, 26 years later, the conversations that I'm having almost on a daily basis. But it's also keeping the lunatic fringe, to describe it, of terrorist organizations on board. You don't want to give them power, then them going to the people that bought into the political process and saying they're apologizing to people that murdered you. So it's a question of timing. So just a couple of thoughts there.
Gary, thank you very much. Max.
So I don't want to, take away the word from somebody that also wants to speak. So, but I had two ideas, just one short to Gary, and then I have something for the acknowledgement part. So Gary, you said that that the role of the international community is going to be very important in the upcoming months here in Israel. But I think the comparison is also a little difficult to Northern Ireland, because you have been mentioning the mutual hurting stalemate that was there. And I think that after this war, we will have a stalemate, yes, but not a mutually hurting stalemate. And I think this makes people, bring up the very concessions that you have been mentioning. And I'll just also, explain my second question. You've been talking about the conflict settings, and I think it is also worthwhile mentioning that the dynamics of conflicts are very different, whether they are international or domestic. And if you have, for instance, domestic conflicts, you have costs and benefits inside of your domestic sphere. So if you make acknowledgement, if you make concessions, you also have benefits from it because your own constituency benefits you for bringing up the peace. But if you have an international conflict and you acknowledge something, you have costs that are going beyond it. So I'm researching on reparations, so if you have a hammer in your hand, everything is a nail. But if we're thinking about reparations, for instance, the very acknowledgement of something, whatever it is, whatever kind of narrative or part of a narrative or part of a conflict, that can imply liability. And I think there we have something that is not going to be beneficial for your domestic politics. Nobody in your constituency will favor money going to another country, whatever it takes. It's never the case. And so this is something where I would just mention that this distinction between domestic conflicts and international conflicts is very, very important at this point.
It's an important distinction, like a lot of other distinctions of type of conflicts. Identity-based conflicts, I would argue, are more difficult in terms of symbolic reparations than wars over resources and territory, where no one would like to give up resources, territory, or money, but you can more easily compromise and offer apologies or other forms of reparations than in cases where it actually requires you to take a critical look at your own historical narrative and your justification for your existence in a way when it's perceived as a zero-sum game. So I would say that there's a lot of categories of conflict where we can look and say, well, these settings matter. But in terms of the internal, external one, a lot of the conflicts don't have that distinction. It's already, to begin with, a domestic and internationalized conflict, including the issue in Northern Ireland that has domestic but international factors, including of course the conflict in Israel that is two separate political systems, but it's in domestic but international conflict as well. So I think that it's true that we can always have adopt additional perspectives and frameworks that contribute to our understandings of the possibilities or impossibilities of trying to advance certain measures. But at the end of the day, I think that a lot of the times those definitions are at best blurry, if at all it's possible to determine one way or the other in the current landscape of global conflict.
I'm slightly different. I do agree. I do think that, we all said earlier, the two-level game becomes more acute when it's international negotiation or international conflict. I'll just take the example of the audience, because you do have, when you're doing a negotiation, international conflict. So think about it. We have the two leaderships, right? And each leadership, let's say Netanyahu, has its own audience cost in Israel, and they have the international audience cost. Same, let's say there is a coherent Palestinian side, but if you say Mahmoud Abbas or Hamas as two actors, they both have audience costs, domestic ones, and they have international ones. So I do think that maybe international conflicts make it more complicated, but I think it also changes the opportunity structure because of that. I'm not saying, I don't want to sound too optimistic, because I'm not, but it does change the opportunity structure, because you do have role for international actors maybe to come in more, because it's also within their interest. For example, the greater stability of the region of the Middle East. It is definitely an interest of the United States, as we've seen from the beginning of the conflict, reiteration of the conflict. So, so you do have a little bit, though I think we have more difficulties because of that, but you might have more opportunities or windows of opportunities to use the other actors, other audiences, and use them instrumentally.
Okay, please, Ronnie.
Leaders, what to do. And they, yes, I'm giving you the opportunity. And they know that if they're going to apologize, or if they're going to acknowledge past crimes, they're going to cost them a lot. And there's going to be a backlash, and they won't be able to continue. Would you tell them to look for a bypass? To look, I'm not too stuck to the idea of offering apology or acknowledgement, but look for bypass. Or is it such a dilemma? I mean, in the end, they will come to the same deadlock. I mean, if they won't speak about the past, they won't be able to continue.
I won't be able to offer a generalized answer for that because I do think that's what the devil is in the details. So each case, I will have to examine the conditions which will make historical acknowledgement strategies more likely. I'll give some cautious examples here in Israel-Palestine, but I'll be very careful and very cautious. So saying that, so think about the Nakba, okay? So is there really going to be such a backlash for that? Okay, okay. You think so? One would think so, right? Because there has been a lot of, for example, counter movements. If you think about the brochure Nakba Charta by Im Tirtzu, which is the whole document which tried to refute the Nakba, which was published. And if you think about the usage of the term, but I would like to suggest move 20 years before, 30 years before. Anyone knew what a Nakba was in Israel? I can tell you no, I have the surveys. So no one knew even what a Nakba is. So now people actually know what a Nakba is in Israel. They may say, appallingly or not appallingly, what you think. We should have done a greater Nakba. We should have done of course it is horrible, it's human rights violation, it's ethnic cleansing. That's the range of views of that. But you have a discourse about it. 30 years ago, there was not even a discourse about it. So for me, when something is part of the discourse, it is opening the way to being used. Just I'm leaving it at this cautious level here. Wait, I think
Sorry.
I think that there's a reason why I don't enforce the policy. But and again, it does depend a lot on the specific details, but there's a lot of ways of acknowledgement. It's not necessarily just a full apology, and the incentive structure and the benefits to it may sway to one way or another. So it's not just a question of should Israel now apologize during a war or straight after the war for the most historically sensitive issue in its existence that may be perceived to undermine its very rationale or justification for existence. The question is, what is the trade-off? What are you getting in return? And is there a political or an international and regional settings in which it will be worthwhile in a specific form, which can be either mutual or limited or in exchange to solving the refugee problem, which would take away a lot of the concerns, demographic concerns for Israel's future. So it really depends on the trade-off. It's not just a question of the cost. It's also the question of the benefits. And not every form of acknowledgement has the same cost structure. So,
Dmitry, I'll maybe just address Max's question there as well. I mean, I suppose looking at international conflicts, Max, there's none that are identical. but I know I'm involved in a project at the moment in Boston, and we're from 1945 to 2018. Every conflict on planet Earth was researched. You're talking like 278, ludicrous amount, unbelievable. And in this project, about 8 of them have a degree of applicability to the Israeli-Palestinian theatre. They're not identical, but there are possible lessons that may be learnt in relation to that. One example of that was in 1996, a number of our politicians went to South Africa to look at the dismantling of apartheid. Now, they were not identical. In fact, they wouldn't even travel in the same plane. They wouldn't eat their meals together. They wouldn't travel in the same buses. But they come back with one concept, and it's a moral concept. They come back with a belief and a hope that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. Now, as an outsider looking in to the region you're in at the moment, it's as almost, there's no hope. Are we destined forever to be in this perpetual state of war? You don't want to reach 800 years as we did until it was resolved, but in what way can this be resolved? The mutually hurting stalemate thing is interesting. And I mean, I say this without mentioning names. I've often used that phrase, particularly in Tel Aviv, pre-October the 7th, of course. And colleagues have said to me, Gary, we're not hurting enough. In other words, the rawness of the Israeli-Palestinian theatre was not affecting people in Tel Aviv to a high degree. That's not minimizing what has happened in the past. This is not me saying this. These are Tel Avivans saying this to me. As I look at your situation now, and I'm not saying, so many Israelis died, so many Palestinians died, so we're not doing a head count of numbers to say who is hurting more. I'm not doing that. But what I'm saying is that everyone is traumatized. And I think maybe, just maybe, and it is maybe, just maybe, out of that, the leadership on both sides and within the international community may be shown to move this forward. I mean, I can't say this definitively, and no one can contradict me in this. No one tomorrow is going to text my colleagues here, Hebrew University, Tel Aviv University, or any university and say, got it, here's the resolution to the Middle East. Most of us have some idea. Is it one state, two states, one homeland, annexation, God forbid, but with some idea? It's leadership. To me, as a person who spent 35 years of my life in this stuff in some of the sharpest, most difficult areas of Belfast in an urban setting, it's leadership in the public space. And in our space, people who pursued terrorism or political violence in the early 90s were making statements or signals, there must be another way. And for me, that's key, because if we're doing numbers, I can give you numbers. IRA killed 60% of people in our conflict. Loyalist groupings killed 30%. State actors killed 10%. I mean, we all know that. But at the end of the day, for us to move out of this, we had to get away with, you did this, you did that. We all know that. And we had to say, is there a possible way forward? Or to put it bluntly, are we going to dump all this junk on the next generation? I had my first grandchild in October. I do not want Annabelle growing up the way I grew up. And my kids are not growing up the way I grew up either. But most peace processes take 50 years to implement. 50 years. We're only 26 years into the process. And that's why most of my life is not spent with people of my generation. I'm pouring my life into young Palestinians, young Israelis, young British, and young Irish. And we're not even going to go near the United States today either. But as you look at that region, when I'm working there, I'm actually trying to pour my life into people in their 20s and 30s. Because if things go badly wrong in the United States, they're going to be the generation that will build the peace. God forbid it ever happens. But the US is not in a pretty place either at the moment. I mean, a person came out the other day and said, we need a civil war. A leading evangelical preacher. We need a civil war? Really? Talk to me about a civil war. Terrified going to school. Going to sleep at night listening to bombs and bullets. You guys know what it's like. So we need leadership in the public square, both politically and within a civic framework. Or we condemn ourselves and the next generation, as we call it here, to a 30-year holiday in hell. And we need to take risks.
Yeah, thank you very much. We should round up our discussion. I think there's a lot of stuff left for the third panel, so I advise you to join us in an hour, because I think we have questions left for debate. So, or Michal, Gary, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Best wishes, everybody.